From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Amber Hodern, and we begin today with breaking news.
Yes, indeed. A new breaker on this Friday on First Republic Bank. Joining us now with details from New York is Bloomberg's Sonali Basak. Bloomberg Sonali Basak, I should say. What do we have in store here, Sonali?
Listen, we do not have an announcement from the FDIC, but we have reporting from news reports saying that there could be an announcement pretty imminent about FDIC receivership of First Republic. Now, remember, Joe, this is a bank that has been sorely beaten in the market, not just this week, but today as well, as the options have run out and really dwindled for a rescue of First Republic ultimately. Remember, the big banks have already stepped in once. There has been very little inclination here to step in again. A deal would be very hard to do given the big hole that exists in First Republic's balance sheet. The idea here is if it were to fall under receivership, it would be easier to figure out what to do from there, potentially a sale, asset sales, what have you. But the reason we're at this point here, I think, is worth noting. It is because the financial situation of First Republic, from earnings on Monday, where there was very little information, to the point that we are today, has been very, very scant information and a deteriorating condition here when you look at the outlook for the bank.
Right, and you can see next to you, Sonali, the shares are down 45% in post-market trading. What happened from last month when Jamie Dimon was in Washington, D.C. and sat down with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, and they decided that the biggest banks were going to inject $30 billion into this bank?
That's a great question. I think that there's been a lot of questions about why the big banks have gotten so silent after that, Anne-Marie. Remember that $30 billion deposit flight from the large banks, as well as some mid-sized banks here and investment banks. Really, the question after that, even the existing deposit base, what happens after 120 days? Remember, it essentially came with an expiration date. Do they take the money out? What happens from there? One of the options that had been long discussed here is getting this consortium of banks to really get together in a fashion where they could either take on assets, convert some of their existing stake to preferred equity, to warrants. But here's the reality from our sources across the street. At the end of the day, how could they make that financially viable for shareholders, for themselves at the end of the day? If the government had not stepped in, and the government plays such a crucial role here, then that banking system savior would not be possible. And the political will here to get a deal done for First Republic, which, remember, the client base here leans towards a wealthier individual who got very low interest loans where the principal payment was delayed. There's such little political will for the government to cater to either a deal for many banks to be in, let alone one bank to be in. If this were to sell to a single bank, it would still require government intervention. And the political will, as we can see up till this point, has been very, very little.
Sonali, thank you so much for your time this Friday evening. You're going to be having a very busy weekend. Our thanks to Bloomberg Sonali Basak. Joe, just to reiterate to our viewers, if you're just tuning in, U.S. Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, is taking this bank into receivership. It's kind of embarrassing at this moment for these big banks and the government that stepped in.
That's right. That was supposed to be a 120-day deposit. Now it's unclear if they'll ever see that money again. And remember, this was a $147 stock in February. And look at this now.
Unbelievable.
Less than $2 as we watch it in real time crumble before our eyes.
Yeah, look at that. $2.10. All right, around the table to discuss this and the political impacts, Bloomberg's Emily Wilkins and Dan Flatley. Dan, let's start with you. At this moment, what is the Treasury Department doing? You know, Sonali made a good point there that it's the political will to get involved or not.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think my mind immediately goes to the politics of this, and a story by our colleague Justin Sink a couple of days ago about Joe Biden running potentially into a recession. So this is, not an indication necessarily that a recession is on the horizon, but it's certainly an indication that there are some tremors in the market and some things that will need to be sort of handled in D.C. before we get to the presidential election next year. So I think that, the president and his team are going to have a challenge here in terms of navigating, as Sonali pointed out, the clientele of this bank being wealthier individuals and trying to stabilize the market and trying to send a signal to the American people that the economy is fine, everything is in good hands, and let's continue, with the current leadership in place.
And behind closed doors right now, whether it's the White House or the Treasury, the word is just don't say bailout, right?
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think that is the term that they want to avoid. They've wanted to avoid that all along. There's some technical reasons why that term, may not be the appropriate term here, but certainly the Republicans may be looking to talk a little bit more about the prospects for a bailout or the need for the administration to engage in that kind of rhetoric. But we'll have to see how this plays out. Certainly a lot to watch.
Yeah.
And is there any indication that you think today meetings were happening behind closed doors, or they just want to keep this as silent as possible? I'm
sure that meetings have been happening, phone calls all day long. I think that they want to keep this as quiet as possible in the sense that, everything is under control. We're not heading into a recession. There's going to be a soft landing. All of these sort of things that you've been hearing from the administration over the last several months, but what we learned today, certainly with this news about First Republic, is that this banking crisis is not over. So it will continue to play out.
Emily Wilkins, bring us to Capitol Hill on this, because obviously we witnessed a couple of hearings. Lawmakers did not agree, Democrats and Republicans, on how to handle all this. And this happens on the same day that the Fed's vice chair for supervision comes out with his internal review on the collapse of SVB. There's going to be another cry, I'm sure you're already hearing them, for increased regulations by Democrats, and most say they're going nowhere.
Yeah, at this point, we really have not had any sort of Republicans get on board with regulations. Even after the reports came out today, House Financial Services Chairman Patrick McHenry said that the report, he criticized it a little bit, said it kind of went a little bit too far, even though there were some parts of it that he did overall agree with. Now, the one area that I think we really could see Congress take on here is clawing back some of those funding from bank executives. You have bills in the House and in the Senate. That's always a good sign. And both of them are bipartisan. You have Elizabeth Warren in the mix, Josh Hawley. I mean, these are folks that aren't always on the same page. And to see them on the same page like this, I think really gives it some momentum, particularly now with everything happening with First Republic. It's going to be back in the news. It's going to be back as a talking point on Capitol Hill. It kind of got lost for a while with everything going on with the debt limit. But when there's a big crisis like this, you usually do see Congress switch its focus and focus on what is going on with the banks and what, if any, role they need to play.
But what happens? They're going on recess. There's just a bank going. Yeah. Yes, but that's where you probably see a lot of the action, right? For wanting to call these people in for hearings?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Kayleigh mentioned that the Senate is going to be having a hearing as well. And look, you talk to lawmakers like, hey, you guys have the debt limit. And the first thing they'll say is they can walk and chew gum at the same time. Patrick McHenry's involved with the debt limit, but he's not the main player. And so he will be focused on this, on the banking moving forward. I mean, Congress does not move very quickly. We all know this here. But at the same point, there does seem to be an interest in moving forward on particular legislation that deals with financial executive salaries and clawing some of that funding back. And I think the fact that now you have these two bills out here now gives us the momentum for committees to begin to pick them up and to move with them. And certainly First Republic gives that much more momentum.
So there's a big question, of course, that we've been asking for weeks, really, if changes made to Dodd-Frank in 2019 led to the collapse of SVB, may have caused more widespread concern. And we talked to Senator Tina Smith, of course, a Democrat, on this yesterday on Balance of Power. Listen.
The Banking Committee then will have an opportunity, once we look at this review, to decide whether there are changes that we need to make to the regulatory regime that we have for banks of this size. The question is, in a committee that is split nearly 50-50, and with what we have going on in the U.S. House, is there a possibility to toughen regulations? If that's what's called for, I hope that we can move that forward.
I don't know what the White House wants to see happen on Capitol Hill, but there was an idea, Dan, that if no further banks failed, nothing would happen. Does First Republic relight the fire here?
I think it's too soon to tell to some extent. I mean, we'll have to see what happens over the weekend, assuming, these reports about the FDIC stepping in are correct, which there's no reason to assume that they're not. But it will depend on how much legs or how many legs this sort of crisis has and whether it leads to legislation. I mean, I think part of what Senator Smith was pointing to is the divided government. So you have the House in Republican control, you have the Senate in Democratic control very, very, very narrowly. So in order to craft new legislation or new regulations, you're going to have to probably tailor it, like Patrick McHenry was talking about, to focus on some key areas. And can they find some agreement there? And can they get something done in a very fraught political environment, in an environment where we're going into an election year? I tend to think no, because nothing is really getting done in D.C. along those lines these days. But a crisis, a continuing crisis, could change that calculation.
Well, the banks are failing quickly, but the actual action in Congress is happening incredibly slowly. We really have seen none. And you made a good point, though. These are reports right now. The FDIC, they have not even announced yet that this bank is going into receivership. But obviously the market is moving off this Reuters report. At some point, though, does this almost maybe help what Biden has been saying, which is that Republicans, well, actually, it was a bipartisan vote in 2018, right, but that there should be stricter regulation? Will he use this and turn it around as his big message going into 2024? There needs to be stronger regulations. Republicans, they're at fault here for why?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will certainly, if this plays out in that direction, I think that could give him, something to talk about, something to point to. Certainly will give Democrats in Congress something to point to. I think it, again, is going to depend a little bit on, where the economy ends up toward the end of the year as we head into 2024. And, whether this is an indication of just a problem with the regulations and you need tighter regulations around these regional banks, or whether this is an indication that the Fed has broken something or that there is something happening with the economy that is going to maybe play against Biden's advantage as the incumbent. So I think, we'll see how that plays out as time goes by.
As we consider the prospect of a recession the back half of this year, Emily, we're waiting for an X date still. And I know this has consumed a lot of your time over the last couple of weeks. Well, to your point, a lot of the banking concerns went on the back burner. When that date arrives, and I'd love to know if you know when we get that, doesn't that change the conversation? Does that light another fire under the politicians here?
Absolutely, especially if we're hearing, as we are now from some reports, that the X date is now expected in June. Yeah. That is not a lot of runway at all for Congress to get things done. And to be frank, if the X date is coming up in June, then I can absolutely see, as Dan was pointing out, this entire debate about banking being completely put on the back burner because suddenly everything needs to be focused on the debt limit and on getting that done. I mean, let's be real. You even talk to Republicans and they'll say, hey, that bill we passed this week, it's not going anywhere. We know that. It's just to get Biden to the negotiating table. And at this point, Biden shows no signs that he's going to be doing that. We really haven't seen anything from the Senate. And it just doesn't seem like we're anywhere closer to actually getting an agreement on lifting the debt limit.
Boy. Still waiting for Fitch and S&P to call, Anne-Marie.
Yeah, exactly.
Great conversation, and thanks to our panel. Emily Wilkins and Dan Flatley covering all ends of these stories. Thank you. Coming up, Ron DeSantis, Kevin McCarthy, and other politicians have all been traveling to Israel these past few days. Is this the newest swing state? We talk about the Jewish state on its 75th anniversary with Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Welcome. Democrats and Republicans staking a claim on Israel as the Jewish state celebrates its 75th anniversary. Ron DeSantis and Hakeem Jeffries among the bold names visiting the country in recent days, with Speaker Kevin McCarthy set to make a trip next week. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's proposed changes to the country's judiciary may spark a new round of protests. We asked House Speaker Kevin McCarthy about the planned changes to Israel's Supreme Court yesterday, right here on Balance of Power. Listen.
He needs to have judicial reform in there. You need a check and balance. You need a rule of law to be able to be successful in any country. And so I think going forward, what he found was he's got to find some common ground.
Joining us now, Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Aaron, thanks for joining us. It's great to see you, and welcome back to Bloomberg. As the Parliament reconvenes, do these proposals see a new turn, a new light of day?
I think we've reached a sort of hiatus, Joe. I mean, the reality is that you've seen now 15 weeks in a row the most unprecedented protests in the history of the State of Israel, cross-sector, cross-generational. Israelis out in the streets protesting what they believe is not judicial reform. They would call it a judicial coup, a transformation, an effort to rearrange the political system in Israel to give the government a major vote and voice and to eviscerate the idea and reality of an independent judiciary. So the stakes are very high. The prime minister has many reasons for wanting this. He's on trial, as you know, for fraud, bribery, and breach of trust in a Jerusalem district court, 3 judges. Trial's been on for 3 years, so there's no doubt that the judicial system needs reform. The problem is it's really very hard to see where the prime minister's personal and political interests and the well-being of the nation begin and end. And I think that's part of the reason you've seen these extraordinary protests, which are going to continue.
As the protests continue, there's a great deal of angst in Israel. If we know that Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, wants to take this back up again, he wants to see the judicial overhaul. If he was to try to get this through, does this basically mean an end to this government? Because clearly this is not what the people want.
What it means, Anne-Marie, I think, is an extraordinary, Israel doesn't have a constitution, but it's the closest thing to a constitutional crisis. Because if, in fact, any of the select pieces of legislation, there are actually 160 as part of this judicial juggernaut, if some of the key pieces are passed when the Knesset resumes, and by the way, this could happen in an afternoon. It's 3 readings in the Knesset. Some of these bills have passed their first reading. Could literally happen in a matter of hours. Then the Supreme Court is going to rule against them. And you're going to have a crisis in which the chief of staff of the Israeli military, the head of Shin Bet, the other security services are going to have to make a decision. Are they going to follow government directives, or are they going to follow what the courts believe is essentially a judicial coup and undermining the rule of law? I don't think that crisis is coming now. Benjamin Netanyahu is pretty risk averse right now. I think he realizes there's serious constraints. He's delayed this. Clearly, they've got to pass the budget in May by law, otherwise the government falls. That'll be the preoccupation when the Knesset resumes. But this is not done by any means.
Aaron, the protests against these proposals have gotten huge coverage. The national strike got huge coverage here in the U.S. for its effectiveness. But tens of thousands of people staged a demonstration in Jerusalem in support of these proposals just yesterday. Who organized that?
That's clearly partly a number of right-wing political parties. I suspect that the prime minister's Likud party had a hand in it as well. The right has actually seemed to be not very well organized or responsive. If you looked at the balance of protests in the street, it's quite clear that those against judicial reform right now have carried the day. And remember, Benjamin Netanyahu fired his defense minister after 4 months, and protests surge, and he's now rehired him. So I think the balance of forces right now on the streets and remaining incredibly peaceful, given the numbers and how high emotions are, balance of forces right now still remain, I suspect, with those who oppose this judicial, let's call it a judicial revolution, because I think that's essentially what it is.
Aaron, we just had Ron DeSantis in Israel, the governor of Florida. We also have Speaker Kevin McCarthy heading there this weekend. He's going to be giving a speech at the Knesset. This will be the second time in history that a Speaker of the House will be giving this address. What do you make of this?
What I make of it is that Israel, once a bipartisan issue, has now emerged almost as a third rail in American politics. I've worked for Republicans and Democrats, half a dozen secretaries of state. I voted for Republicans and Democrats. But what you have now is a Republican Party that has emerged more or less, and I don't think I'm exaggerating here, as the Israel right or wrong party. What you have among the Democrats are divisions, traditional supporters of Israel who are increasingly critical of some of the policies, particularly toward the Palestinians, that the current government has adopted, and a smaller wing of the Democratic Party, progressives, which want to impose accountability and cost on Israel for these policies. This is no longer the sort of solid bipartisan support on which Democrats and Republicans could somehow agree across the board. And Mr. Netanyahu, frankly, if you ask me, I think he'd much prefer the re-election of Donald Trump or Republican avatar in 2024. Much more comfortable Mr. Netanyahu is with a Republican president than he is with Democrats.
Aaron, thank you so much for your time this Friday. Aaron David Miller there. Coming up on the program, we're going to get back to that breaking news. FDIC looks to be putting First Republic under receivership. This is according to reports. They have not done so yet officially, but reports are that the FDIC is preparing to take First Republic under receivership. And Katie Lyons will be back with more. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. Let's get back to the breaking news in the banking sector. First Republic plunging in post-market trading on a report that the FDIC is going to put it into receivership immediately. Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons is here with more. Kaylee, right now it's just reports. We don't know for sure from FDIC, but what's the latest?
Yeah, right now that is what we have from Reuters, is that this is happening imminently. Up to your interpretation what eminently means, but we had seen in the case of Silicon Valley Bank that it happened in the middle of a day on a Friday. And of course, already we are in the after hours trade, which is very painful for First Republic, down 42% after already today losing more than 40% of its value in the regular session. Now a $2 stock. It has been absolutely brutal for this name. And of course, we've been waiting for some time to see what kind of resolution would come for this bank. The government has been holding out, hoping for a private sector solution, but none of the other larger banks have stepped up. And as a result, we may be seeing now that this is the last resort and that receivership becomes the only real option.
You brought us back for a second to SVB when it became clear that the FDIC was on site. It was just a matter of time before receivership was made official. That could be the case today. Here we are on a Friday with little time left in the day. So this could be a matter of hours. Yeah,
it certainly could. And in theory, you would expect something to be announced by the end of the weekend before futures open at 6 p.m. So we'll, of course, stay tuned for updates. But a busy day in banking, guys, because, of course, this also comes right after Fed Vice Chair Michael Barr released his report on what happened with the failure of SVB. And perhaps regulators are now going to have to add another bank failure to their list.
They're starting their failure of the First Republic, potentially, starting there. What happened with First Republic?
Well, I think it was Kaylee yesterday who said when that report lands, it may already be dated. Here we are. Kaylee, thank you. Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons with the breaking news today. Coming up, we'll discuss today's two big oversight reports on SVB, signature banks, and now this with former FDIC Chair Bill Isaac. That's coming up next on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Thanks for joining us. First Republic shares slumping post-market after a Reuters report the FDIC was preparing to place it into receivership imminently. And we turn to Bill Isaac, the former chair of the FDIC, for some insights on this. Bill, thank you so much for joining us on an important day here. What do you think's about to happen this weekend?
Well, I don't know, but clearly they have two choices. Maybe more than two, but there's two primary choices. One is to sell the bank to somebody, and there's a number of banks that put money into it at the request of the FDIC, and I'm sure they're having conversations with them about whether any of them or some combination of them might like to acquire it. The other is the FDIC will take it over and turn it into a FDIC-run bank for at least a while, and then figure out after that where they go with it.
What happens now? Does the government, do they systemically say that this is a systemically important bank and then they can go in and potentially make those depositors whole? But we do know politically that might be difficult.
They could do that. I don't think it's necessary. This bank is a bank that the FDIC ought to be able to take over and handle well. And there are ways that they can deal with depositors. We did some of those things in the 1980s. For example, it's possible that they could take care of the large depositors in a way that we did in the 80s, which would be to do a partial payoff of those depositors up front and then more later. So I think they have a lot of tools they can use. And I think what you want to do in a bank failure is not have it be too disruptive. And I think they need to be mindful of that, taking care of the uninsured depositors for sure, taking care of the insured depositors for sure, and then the uninsured, taking care of them as best you can without causing a lot of disruption, and taking care of businesses that don't want to lose their business accounts. So there's things that I mean, I've been writing about some things that we need to do to improve the deposit insurance system and the way it operates. But a lot of these things the FDIC can actually do without new legislation.
Well, we've had a bit of a collision of headlines today, Bill, because this news hits the same day that the Fed is out with its report on the collapse of SVB. And there have been a lot of questions about what the response should include more broadly from Washington. Can you speak to our viewers, though, about the differences in these cases? Because it's pretty tough to connect the dots between SVB and First Republic. Is this something that calls for a broad approach or a precise one with each bank?
Well, each bank is different, and you have different issues that you have to deal with depending on what's in the bank, what depositors are in, and how many uninsured there are, and how many business accounts there are. There's a lot of things that you have to consider because you do not want the failure to be really disruptive in the local communities. And so I don't think there's a one size fits all, but I do think the FDIC has a lot of discretion and ability to shape different transactions in different ways. And another important part is who would like to buy this bank, if anyone. And so I think there's a lot. It's hard to say that there's a standard way to handle a bank failure. I think when I was at the FDIC, we handled thousands of banks and S&Ls that failed, and a lot of them followed the same format, but a lot of them didn't. A lot of them had to be specially tailored for the things that were important in that transaction to the public.
Given you were in this position before, can you maybe give us some insight and walk us through what's happening right now, given the fact that we know that we are waiting for this major announcement from the FDIC?
I don't know what's happening right now. I know that there's been a lot of negotiation going on among the banks that are considering how they might be helpful, and the FDIC. And I'm sure that a lot of those discussions involve people from the bank itself. But if they're not doing a takeover deal, if the FDIC is instead going to take over the bank and put it in a bridge bank temporarily, at least, the FDIC is very busy right now trying to figure out how to get that all done. They don't have a lot of time. They need to get it done over a weekend. And the FDIC probably has a lot of people in there right now, I would guess.
Yeah. Bill, you mentioned deposit insurance. Can we put a finer point on that? Because that was a big point of debate a couple of weeks ago following the collapse of SVB and then Signature. There were lawmakers who thought the $250,000 threshold should be increased. It's starting to look like nothing is going to change, should it?
Well, things will change. There hadn't been time for any changes yet. I don't believe the $250,000 limit needs to be increased. The purpose of deposit insurance was to take care of smaller depositors who didn't have the sophistication and the time and the knowledge to protect themselves. I think we can expect that larger depositors don't need to be protected to that extent, to have all of their deposits covered. I do think they ought to be at risk to some degree, so we have some depositor discipline, some marketplace discipline in these banks when they take in these big investors. I believe the deposit insurance system does need to be reformed. It's been a long time since it's had a significant reform. I do believe that business accounts, checking accounts, for example, that don't pay interest, need to be protected. I would protect them all the way. Because they're not chasing rates, they're not causing trouble. They are business accounts. They're meeting payrolls and doing all sorts of things that are important to the local economy and the overall economy. So I would protect those fully. I believe that the $250,000 limit is just fine for the smaller depositors. I think that the larger depositors, we need to have a plan where they get most of their money right away. and the FDIC it will be given to them by the Fed. The FDIC will repay the Fed, and the FDIC will collect the assets of the failed bank and repay the Fed with that money. And if there's any excess money over that, that can be given to the larger depositors that took a slight haircut on what they were getting. So things like that are what need to be done. And the FDIC, I think, needs to be a more independent agency than it is now. When I was chairman, it was very independent. The Fed was very independent. And we've gone away from that. And I think that gets politics way too involved in bank failures. And we need to have more independence in these agencies so they can do what needs to be done without regard to who's concerned about it from a political standpoint.
Bill, thank you so much for your time. Bill Isaacs, former chair of the FDIC. What a great day, really evening, Joe, to have him on as we are waiting for the FDIC to actually say that they're putting this bank into receivership.
A little peek behind the curtain there, and really a full-throated endorsement of unlimited protection for business deposits, the checking accounts that don't draw interest. That's fascinating.
Also, he doesn't think it's independent enough.
How about that?
Yeah, I'd like to hear what they have to think about that. Coming up, we'll break down how this is all playing in Washington with our political panel. That's next. From Washington, this is Balance of Power.
Now, keeping you up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. I'm John Hyland. Ukraine is finalizing its plans for a counteroffensive. The nation's defense chief says final preparations are underway for a plan that's expected to attempt to dislodge Russian forces from parts of Ukraine's southeast. And he says some weapons and equipment for the counteroffensive have already been delivered. It's the biggest civil penalty ever for the CFTC. A U.S. judge has ordered a South African executive to pay more than $3.4 billion in fines and restitution for a fraud scheme involving Bitcoin. The executive has been arrested and is being held in Brazil. In sports news, the Carolina Panthers selected Alabama quarterback Bryce Young with the first pick of the NFL draft. The Houston Texans and another quarterback, Ohio State's C.J. Stroud, at number 2. Round 2 of the draft is tonight. And sticking with sports, Lamar Jackson has become the highest paid player ever in the NFL. According to multiple reports, the Baltimore Ravens quarterback has agreed to a 5-year, $260 million deal. $185 million of that is guaranteed. Jackson negotiated the deal on his own without an agent. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Originals. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm John Hyland, and this is Bloomberg.
Still following breaking news here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. First Republic, we are waiting potentially for that bank to go into receivership. This is according to reports from Reuters from the FDIC. Joining us to discuss our closers this Friday evening, Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner, joins us here in studio, and Jeannie Shan-Zeno, political science professor at Iona University, is in New York City. Jeannie, I have to start with you. Potentially, we're going to get another bank failing on the horizon. How bad is this for the Biden administration?
This is an enormous concern. This is what they were hoping to stave off when they brought together Jamie Dimon, Secretary Yellen, to try to, put this off and see if they could address it. They weren't able to, and now it looks like they may go into receivership. They're, of course, trying to avoid that word that they've been trying to avoid since SVB bailout. But I think it becomes a lot more difficult for them if this does go into receivership. And, of course, Joe Biden is facing a lot of trouble on the economic front. We didn't hear a lot about it in his announcement last Tuesday because his poll numbers there are not as strong as the administration would like them to be. This is an area where don't feel confident about Joe Biden's presidency and leadership. So this is a huge challenge for them, very much in line with what they were facing last year as with inflation. And now you couple that with this, and they're going into an election season, a tough battle for them when the economy is the #1 issue for voters.
Mm-hmm. So not a good headline politically here. If you're the president watching this, obviously the White House didn't want to see another bank fail here, Rick. Reluctant to use the word bailout, for instance. A couple different things could happen this weekend. Are they praying for a successful bid on First Republic right now?
I think that's probably their top priority, but the damage is already done, right? Today's news has just been dominated by bad banking news, right? The Fed put out their report, self-critical about how they allowed SVB basically to fail, and now the news all afternoon is that, we've got this problem with First Republic. Every effort to try and keep it alive looks like hasn't been successful. So on a week that I think Biden would have liked to have gone into the weekend with sort of a glow of being a new candidate for president and some positive economic news that he got earlier in the week, he's going to get slammed. And so this is not how the White House was looking to go into the weekend.
How do they play this? Do they send Secretary Yellen on a Sunday show like they did last time? Does Biden come out Monday morning before the markets open and give a speech?
Now, my sense is they'll want to downplay it because there hasn't been a lot of reporting today about this being a contagion issue, right? Somehow if First Republic goes down, that's going to ignite a bunch of other state banks or smaller banks to go under or have capital flight. That doesn't seem to be the issue this time around. They've tightened up the screws on a lot of these banks in the ensuing period since SVB. And so I think they'll probably try to brush by it and maybe have to walk Yellen out during the week sometime when they know exactly what the disposition of First Republic is going to be.
And for Jeannie, the J.P. Morgans and others who put billions of dollars into First Republic as part of a deal to help rescue the bank with the Treasury just weeks ago. It's the cost of doing business?
Yeah, I mean, they are going to have to chalk it up to that, but we saw more and more reluctance to get involved, and they really were looking for the federal government to act at this point. And of course, to Rick's point, it's a heck of a week for this to happen with the Biden administration, his announcement that he's going to run. And of course, next week, we are looking at potentially another hike in interest rates on the heels of this. And this kind of insecurity and uncertainty is what makes people nervous and makes it harder for the president to say, give me another 4 years. Granted, there's still a long way to go before the election, but this is not the way he wanted to spend the first few hours after his rollout. And of course, he's got big donors coming to D.C. this weekend to talk about investing billions in his reelection bid.
Yeah, kind of an awkward moment, really, for this bank to be failing. Joe talks about the fact that they don't want to use the word bailout. During the Carter administration, Alfred Kahn, the economist, Carter hated the word recession. So they say, sir, we're in a banana, we're having a banana. That was the key word. But if they're going to be silent on it, doesn't that also not help them in the sense that Biden wants to also come out and make regulation an issue for 2024? He says that the banks should be regulated more tough, and he's siding with the likes of Senator Elizabeth Warren. He's annoyed about the 2018 rollbacks of Dodd-Frank. So at some point, they have to touch on this.
I wouldn't be surprised if they use it as rhetoric, but not really put legislation in Congress. Look, the reality is that no initiative from this administration is going to get an equal hearing in the House of Representatives, right? I mean, they're just not going to take up bills like this for regulation. He has to rely on the Fed to want to tighten it down. They indicated in the report released today that they would. So he may take some credit for that. But really his biggest concern, and Jeannie mentioned this earlier, that he literally said nothing about the economy in his announcement video, is the talk about going into a recession, continuing troubles, with a banana, and he's so old he doesn't buy green bananas, but that's the only banana I'm aware of. But it's a struggle for him because he needs to address this. Voters, it's their number one issue. If he actually wants to have a dialogue with voters, he's going to have to talk about the economy.
Rick and Jeannie, stay with us. Coming up, anti-abortion bills failing in South Carolina and Nebraska. Our panel will talk it out with us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
To me, this issue has taken up more time than anything else in the Senate, where I have worked for the past 7 years. I know some women disagree with me on this, but certainly in my area, the majority of women agree with me that this needs to be done. We need to let go of it.
The total ban that's being debated here today clearly places the rights of a fetus over the rights of the women and girls will be forced by our male-dominated legislature to carry that fetus to term.
By a vote of 23 to 20, the Senate stands adjourned to meet at noon on Tuesday.
That was earlier this week on the South Carolina Senate floor as Republican dissenters hold up abortion bans in Republican-controlled Nebraska and South Carolina. We welcome back our panel, Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. Jeannie, what was striking to me in both these states is that there's Republican women are telling the men, and one of the quotes was, "Men, stop bringing this up and slapping this in our faces. You're encouraging us to continue to have to talk about this." If you see this in these state legislators, this does not bode well for the Republicans going to 2024.
It does not. You know, some people have described it as the dog catching the car. They got what they wished for with Roe being overturned, and their promise with that was they would take it to the states and they would ban abortion. Well, now we know that that is not good politics. And as you mentioned, we saw these women senators in 2 key states stand up. In South Carolina, the 3rd time since Dobbs that they tried to push through an outright ban on abortion. And conservative pro-life women standing up in the Senate and saying enough is enough to the gentleman in the Senate, and saying, one of the quotes said something like, "We can control ourselves. We are fine. Stop." And so this is where Republicans are at this point, and it's going to follow them right into the 2024 contest as they try to figure out how to message on this. And I think Nancy Mace at the federal level has been a great example for them, but they don't seem to be following her down that path.
So we're not talking about 2 blue states here, obviously, Rick, far from. And following what we saw in Kansas, even Wisconsin, following what we saw in the midterms, if you're advising a candidate running for national office in the next year here, what is the message when you put all of these signs together?
I think that the message for any national candidate is going to have to derive from where they're coming from, right? So Governor DeSantis has an initiative for a 6-week abortion ban in Florida. And it would be very hard for him to walk away from that, even though that is a little bit outside the mainstream of even Republican primary voters. And what we see with the example of South Carolina and North Carolina is that abortion terms are not monolithic within the GOP, right? A lot of the GOP has different views on what the terms of a appropriate abortion law, especially at the state level, should be. And we've even seen the debate in the United States Senate about whether or not you would have a national law that would override all those things. And even though Lindsey Graham represents a view that maybe you have a national law that evens out the abortion rules state by state, a lot of Republicans believe that that would be a disaster politically and would just as soon allow these states to do their own thing and decide. And so I think it's going to be very difficult. You're going to have a debate with maybe half a dozen Republican primary candidates where every one of them has a different take on abortion, and voters are going to have a very difficult time discerning where you fit into their construct on this.
Yeah, because the general election, they're going to have to try to move a little bit more to the center if they want to pick up votes from suburban women and independents. This is going to be a huge issue going to 2024. Also, it was just this week that we know who the Democratic nominee is likely going to be, and that's Joe Biden. And this weekend, Joe, of course, you and I will be there. He will be speaking at the Correspondents' Dinner.
Yes.
Potentially a bank will be in receivership, and also he has an American journalist abroad in his family. Evan Gershowitz's parents are going to be there. It's going to be difficult.
It's always a real test at this event when you're supposed to be telling jokes and you've got the real world spinning around you.
Jeannie, just with Biden this weekend, speaking to a room full of journalists and others, it's going to be a different lens people place on him. He's now a candidate.
That's right. And, we're already hearing some of what he may be roasted about. But, of course, with all, as you mentioned, these events swirling around, it's going to be a bit more somber, perhaps, than in other years, I think, particularly given the Wall Street Journal reporter. And, of course, as you mentioned, the fact that Joe Biden has just announced his intention to seek another term. So it's going to be a great event. I think you and Joe will have a great time in rainy D.C. And I can't wait to hear how it is.
Thanks so much, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shan Zaino, for joining us, our closers this Friday, as we still await what happens with FDIC this Friday evening.
You said it could be a newsy weekend. Say hi to us at the dinner and check out the new Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.